What's in this thing?
Today we have the Zotac GTX 295 and I'm going to overclock it. Released by NVIDIA in early 2009 as a top-of-the-range card, this GTX 295 is the dual PCB model that has literally two separate PCBs sandwiched around a heatsink and fan. Costing around £420, $500 at launch, it was expensive, power-hungry and fast. The GTX 295 comes stock with a core clock of 576 MHz, a shader clock of 1242 MHz and a memory clock of 999 MHz. I'm going to see how far we can push it and what results we can get. Before we start the test, let's have a look at the test system. For CPU, I have an Intel i7-980 overclocked to 4.24 GHz. The motherboard is a Gigabyte GAEX58 Extreme. We have 24 GB of Crucial Ballistics Tactical 1600 MHz. The GPU is of course the GTX 295. There's a 120 GB SSD to boot off and a Cooler Master Watt Lite 700 watt. You may have noticed the extra fans. In my initial testing, I noticed the temperatures were getting way too high, even at stock. So I got a little bit creative. 5 extra fans. 4 120mm fans and a 92mm at the back to create extra airflow over the card. Now that's out of the way, let's start with the baseline. I'm going to be using Catzilla 720p to perform the tests. At stock speeds, we get a score of 5915 with a max GPU 1 temp of 70 degrees Celsius and a max GPU 2 temp of 67 degrees Celsius. For the next test, I went with 666 MHz core, 1440 shader and 1152 memory. This gives a score of 6802, a 15% improvement from a 15-ish% overclock, nice and linear. The max temperature on GPU 1 was 89 degrees and 85 degrees on GPU 2. Next, I wanted 700 MHz core, so instead I got 702 MHz with 1512 shader and 1188 memory. This gave a result of 7085, a 19.78% improvement over stock with a max GPU 1 temp of 93 Celsius and 89 Celsius on GPU 2. Ideally, I wanted to get to 720 MHz core, but I just couldn't get a stable run at that speed, even with more VRM voltage, which just made everything too hot, and tweaks to shader and memory clock. So instead, I got 713 MHz core, 1548 shader, and 1188 memory. This gave a result of 7194, with a GPU 1 temp at 98 degrees and GPU 2 at 93 degrees. Unfortunately, this was as far as I could push this particular card without crashes or artifacts. This final run got me worried when it crashed and the LEDs on the back of the card were red. I tried to reboot the machine and it booted with no display output, so I was worried that I'd kill the card. After this, I decided to stop there. So what did we learn? Probably the main thing is that dual PCB cards get very hot. I think it's just difficult to get effective cooling with heat coming from both sides of the heatsink. 21.62% increase over stock benchmark score in exchange for a massive 40% increase in temperatures. Is it worth it? Probably not, but it does look cool. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this is useful to someone.